Good afternoon, everyone, and you're very welcome to the penultimate Link and Learn webinar of 2021, where we'll be looking at the very topical questions of workplace wellbeing and the work-life balance. Our first speaker is Ilse White, who's one of the research team here at Learnovate, and she's going to take us through some of the research that she's conducted in the last 6 months on the subject of wellbeing and its place in the workplace. Ilse joined the Learnovate team in the beginning of this year, having spent 15 years in a variety of roles in Google as part of their people development team. So now I'll hand you over to Ilse. So it's over to you, Ilse. Take it away.
Thanks for that kind introduction, Frank, and hello and welcome everyone. Thanks for taking the time to join us this lunchtime. I'm delighted to share some of the insights from my research on well-being with you today, and I really hope you'll walk away with this with a couple of useful bits of information or even ideas for your personal or workplace well-being. For me, taking a deep dive into the world of well-being has been quite fascinating, and I'll hope you share the sentiment at the end of the session. So without further ado, let's get started. I'll talk about 3 things with you today. First, I'll share some of the insights of the research I conducted to give you like a baseline understanding of some of the key theories and schools of thoughts that are at play. And then I'll talk a little bit about what's needed to achieve a culture of workplace well-being. And I'll finish off with a section of personal well-being and share some of the insights and takeaways around how we can look after our own personal well-being, which we all know is not as easy as it sounds. First up, let's look at what the research says about well-being. It's rather a lot, so bear with me as I provide you with some of the context and share some of the theories with you. I like to start by giving some context around why well-being has become such a hot topic of conversation and will continue to be so. And it's really down to our levels of well-being consistently decreasing over the past 4 to 5 decades, which is a bit surprising seeing as our prosperity and our standards of living have increased. So we'll come back a little bit later to why that might be. So overall, our well-being is not doing that well, which is a problem, because we know that when people in their role as employees have good well-being, they're more likely to be engaged with their work and productive. And that's super important for organizations because as we're heading into Industry 4.0 or even 5.0, the workforce well-being and engagement will increasingly become a competitive advantage for organizations, because the human characteristics that we have and our skills will increasingly become the differentiating factor that will gain organizations a competitive advantage. So what researchers have been seeing over time is that there's also a shift happening from work-life balance to maybe work-life integration. So we all live in these different worlds. We have our families, our friends, at work, our communities, and these worlds are increasingly overlapping. So this is what we're talking about when we say the lines are being blurred. And that's, of course, not in the least accelerated by the global pandemic that we find ourselves in at the minute. So what's important to note is that organizations do recognize the need to improve workplace well-being, but there's a bit of a gap between recognizing the need and actually implementing a well-being strategy around that, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. But first, I'll give you some information about some of the key well-being theories. So when we started our research, I quickly found out that well-being is a much researched topic and it's ever evolving. I'll explain some of the key theories so you get a sense of what the school of thoughts are in the area. Diving into the first one, the hedonic versus the eudaimonic traditions, big words there. And it refers to a big well-being debate that is not new and in fact has been discussed since by philosophers as early as 400 BC. And what you can see that even in those early days, there is 2 important schools of thought that are developing: hedonism and eudaimonia. And at a high level, followers of the hedonism tradition consider that maximizing pleasure is the ultimate goal in life. And then on the other hand, the followers of the eudaimonic tradition see it a little bit differently. They feel that life's goal is to live a fulfilling life and aiming for a greater purpose and achieving meaning through everything that we do. A fun fact, like you'll see on this slide, that I'm using the word happiness here instead of well-being well-being, and it's sort of interchangeable with well-being in the context of the research. And the reason for that is that happiness was found a lot harder to measure than well-being, but both of them can be used in the same context and refer to really a state of our optimal life satisfaction. So when we talk about hedonic happiness, it is all about maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. And advocates for this tradition feel that we all have a set base point of happiness. So we engage in activities that give us pleasure or that mitigate feelings of pain, but ultimately we come back down to this base point of happiness, and that is called hedonic adaptation. We seek out the things that make us happy, but that happiness only lasts for a short time. And when you look at eudaimonic happiness, that concentrates on engaging in meaningful activities. So they require greater thought and more effort. So, for example, setting your life goals is harder than eating a donut, for example. But the long-term effect on our happiness and well-being is greater when we engage in eudaimonic happiness activities. And the debate about which one is better or more important has been raging for a long time. But I think by now researchers largely agree that both the hedonic and eudaimonic behaviors are needed to maximize our happiness and our well-being. So while caring for others and being kind, which would be eudaimonic activities, take more effort and practice, we also need to reward ourselves with some of the short-term happiness from time to time, so we can eat those donuts without feeling too much shame. Moving on to the second theory then, which is the Decky and Ryan's self-determination theory. This really provides a broad framework for the study of human motivation and personalities. And I know this graphic may look a bit complicated when you look at it, so let me talk you through it at a high level. So the self-determination theory proposes that every person has a number of psychosocial needs, which you can see at the bottom end of the image on the screen. They are relatedness, competence, and autonomy, and the degree to which any of these psychological needs are met in any given social situation has a big impact on our well-being in that setting. So, for example, our needs for relatedness can be met if we're in a caring environment, but they can also be undermined by criticism or traditions, for example. Our competence can be undermined by, for example, receiving excessive challenges that we can't meet, and can be enhanced by positive performance feedback, for example. And finally, the autonomy, the need for autonomy, it can be improved by giving people choice, for example, and can be undermined by imposed goals that come from management or leadership, for example. And the way that we as individuals internalize the extent to which those those basic psychosocial needs are met determines our level of motivation, and then by proxy our levels of engagement, our performance, and our well-being. So that's how that one works. The third key theory is the theory of positive psychology. This one you may have heard about before. So Martin Seligman is widely regarded as the originator of this domain of psychology that's become a bit of a phenomenon over the past 20 odd years or so. And I personally love the story that positive psychology started as a reaction to what was then common practice in psychology that really emphasized treating mental illness and treating the negative effects of bad psychological well-being. Positive psychology's main focus is on people's strengths, their virtues, and their talents in order to flourish as people, and it's really focused on prevention rather than curing. What you see on the screen is the core of the positive psychology theory, which is the PERMA Plus or PERMA V model, and it details the most important elements of happiness and well-being. So everything that we need to flourish and be our best selves and lead a meaningful life. And one of the unique selling points, if you like, of this model is that all of the elements that are in here are measurable. And that's something that psychology and researchers had been struggling with before. I won't talk through all of the different elements here, but what I do want to mention is that The model was further developed to add the component of vitality, which includes the more physical contributors to well-being, so things like eating well, exercise, and sleeping. And like I mentioned before, all of the elements of this can be practiced and measured independently, and there's exercises for all of these. The overall motto of the model, is that well-being is about doing good, it's about feeling good and functioning well, and it's about living a meaningful life. And then the last theory I want to discuss, it gives us another rather complicated looking image of a model, and that is the JDR, or the Job Demands and Resources theory, that has been developed by Bakker and Demaruti. And I included this theory because it emphasizes the component of the need for balance in workplace well-being. The concept of this, I think, is simple enough. So every person, every employee has a number of job demands and a number of job resources. The job demands are the things that cause us stress, or the physical or emotional stressors in our roles. So, for example, things like time pressure or poor relationships with our colleagues, ambiguity about our roles, stressful working environment, or a heavy workload. I think, unfortunately, we're all familiar with some of those, I think. Job resources, on the other hand, are the physical, social, and organizational factors that help us achieve our goals. So, for example, things like autonomy, having strong work relationships, opportunities for advancement, and things like coaching and mentoring, and learning and development. And what all those arrows and pluses and minuses in this graphic signify is that when job demands are high and your job positives are low, stress and burnout are common and your performance suffers. And then on the other hand, when our job resources are plentiful, they can encourage motivation and engagement and improve performance. And our personal resources, which you see there as well, so our skills and resilience, can help us find the right balance between the job demands and job resources that we need to feel engaged and to perform. So you see, like, it's really, our well-being is all a matter of balance, and that's exactly how well-being is defined in the literature as well. It's achieved when our personal resources and are balanced with the challenges that we face, which is all nice and well and easy said than done. But in real life, that balance and this graphic might look a little bit more like this, right? So we constantly have to balance all the elements of our lives with the resources that we have and navigate our life path, which at times can feel a bit more like an obstacle course rather than a smoothly paved road. And that's just to say that the road to a meaningful life is not really that easy. Thankfully, though, as humans are made of strong stuff, we can invest in and maintain our good well-being by improving our resilience, which is generally considered to be the antidote to stress and burnout, which are the manifestations of bad well-being, which we have a lot of as well. Resilience really is the elasticity that we need to bounce back and regain our balance all the time. And the good news is that we can improve that resilience by learning new skills and developing and practicing good habits for our well-being. And the better we are at this, the more likely we are to have good well-being and flourish. So in the next section, I'll focus on workplace well-being. But before I do that, I want to stress again that well-being is a highly dynamic construct in which all of the components that make up the system change all the time, they impact on each other, and we need our resources to maintain balance. And a very real example of that dynamic is what we refer to as work-life balance, which is probably the ultimate example where different and competing elements of our well-being mix and collide and sometimes even collaborate. And that mixing is referred to as crossover. Now, the crossover and spillover of our resources between a person's work and life can either have a positive or a negative effect on well-being. Sometimes we want it, sometimes we prefer not to have it, and it impacts us differently. So mitigating the negative effects of crossover and spillover and maximizing the positive impact are key to managing the work-life system. And that's where boundaries come in. So boundaries are interfaces between our work and lives, regulate our work-life systems in a way that enhance our well-being. They really provide the structure and the regulation that we as individuals need to make our life work systems work. And that looks different for everybody. So defining a successful work-life balance is not just up to the individual. It's a constant ongoing negotiation with work, with family, with our communities, in order to decide to what extent work and life are either segmented or integrated. And the objective is to have the best interest for all concerned in mind. So I hope by now you have a bit of a good understanding of some of the key theories and thoughts about well-being from the research. And in this next section, I'll talk a bit more about workplace well-being. And the overview I'll give you is pretty high level, but today's panelists have really some great thoughts about best practice, and it's really their bread and butter. So I encourage you to get your questions ready for Crida and Michelle, and add them to the chat as you think of them as we go through this. So when it comes to workplace well-being, any strategy that's implemented should be holistic, and the only way to do it is if the importance for business success is recognized. And I read a Deloitte study where and that suggested that about 80% of organizations do recognize the importance of workplace well-being. This is a very recent 2021 study for their company's performance, but really only 12% of those feel that they have what it takes to address that challenge. So a bit of a gap there. And I came across this equation that I think represents the right formula for a successful well-being strategy pretty well. All the variables, leadership, environment, resilience, are interdependent, and the responsibility for each is shared by both the individual and the organization. So I'll talk a little bit more about each of these in the next slides. Really full slide this. So, but when it comes to workplace well-being, the goal is to establish a culture of well-being. But just as maintaining balance for our personal well-being is not easy, establishing that culture of well-being is not easy either. And possibly the worst thing an organization can do is to claim that they have a well-being culture in the workplace when the employee experience is quite the opposite. So recognizing that workplace well-being is closely tied to performance is the start of establishing that culture. It's about understanding that happy people perform better, which ultimately has an impact on business success. And with the levels of well-being in decline, we and organizations are obviously not doing the best of jobs just yet. So what organizations need is a strategy, a long-term plan that's part of the company's value and strategy. And that really starts with understanding the existing culture before making a plan to improve it, which is not easy again. As with so many things, shifting a culture starts with leadership. If the organization claims that it prioritizes the well-being of its employees but sets unrealistic expectations, or if leadership does not role model the behaviors that are necessary to promote that good well-being, then the effort is inauthentic and won't be successful. Another faux pas is to achieve a cultural shift. To achieve the culture shift is to assume that organizations know what it is that employees need. It's really different for everybody, and the trick is to listen to what those needs are, and for employees as well, to tell their employees what they need, using the channels that they have to do that. And it will be interesting to see how this conversation shapes up as people are returning to work soon. So it's a perfect moment to have this conversation, I think. So a good start is to create the conditions for a healthy culture, is to foster resilience, to celebrate diversity and create a level of psychological safety in the organizations, as well as supporting line managers by setting expectations around well-being and equipping them to have the skills to address those. And when it comes to the work environment, the second variable in the equation, it's important to remember that well-being has multiple tenets or elements that are much more dynamic than the list on this slide. So there are psychological well-being, which includes mental health, our physiological well-being, which includes our physical workspace, our societal well-being, which is the role we play in work and life and our communities, and our financial well-being, which enables to meet the basic needs as well as invest in more resources to improve our well-being. And all of these are equally important, and any well-being strategy should consider interventions to address all of these areas, really. The final element in the well-being equation is resilience. And I hope you remember me mentioning that resilience is the antidote to stress earlier. And the more resilient we are, the more we are able to balance our challenges. And the good thing is that all of these underlying cognitive skills for resilience and well-being can be learned and developed, and organizations should find ways to invest in their employees to just do that. And all of these 26 skills that are listed here are proven to have a long-lasting and positive effect on our well-being if they're further developed and practiced. To close off this section on workplace well-being, I've listed some best practice interventions that could be considered by organizations. Again, it's important to stress that any strategy should be holistic, and one of these is not going to make all the difference to truly achieve that culture of well-being. However, it might give you some idea about what is considered and what can be successful. So some of these, like job crafting and employee-centered people policies, require big effort from the organization to be implemented, but those can be really successful because they put the employees' needs first and can meet the needs of many. More tactical approaches include offering career supports and opportunities, as well as offering training and resources to improve resilience and mental health. And then there's company-wide events and challenges are a great way to generate interest and engagement. And while a one-off event is unlikely to move the needle, a calendar of events that support it could be impactful to drive that engagement that you need and get awareness and skilled participation. And the last one I added are some of the more technology and data-driven approaches to understand the needs of the employees. And some examples include asking about well-being in something like employee motivation surveys, or gathering insights on well-being levels through a diagnostic tool or a mobile app that collects data from employees on an ongoing basis. So really using people analytics to support insights on well-being. So that was the workplace well-being, and the last topic I want to address is the personal well-being, and in particular the science of it. So I personally found this very insightful and fascinating when I researched it, so I hope you will too. And the science of well-being, of personal well-being, centers around that goal that we all share. Like, we want to achieve good well-being, be happy and flourish. That's a bit of a no-brainer. I don't know many people who aim to be unhappy. But our minds and our brains makes us actually want the wrong things to achieve good well-being, and that's referred to as miswanting. And basically what that means is that our own mind tricks us into wanting things that we think make us happy, but they actually don't make us happy, or they don't make us as happy as we think they do, and we let ourselves be tricked by that. So and that's why our well-being usually leaves a little bit to be desired. So thankfully, we can rewire our brain by practicing better wanting. And before we find out how, I'll dive a little bit more into the miswanting part a little first. All of these things that you see on the slide here do make us happy to some extent, but none of them make us as happy as we think. Not even finding true love, which is kind of proven by divorce rates everywhere. So over time, we've built like these social and economic constructs that make us think, it makes us actually think that we know that these things are the ones that will make us happy. So if I buy the house of my dreams, if I have a great job with a great salary, or if I have the perfect body or find my soulmate, that's when I will be so happy. And right now you probably think, no, that's not me. I don't think that way. I'm smarter than that. But actually, we all think that way. And what the research shows is that we're spending a lot of time, and in fact, too much time, maybe pursuing just these things when there's more that we should be aiming for. And while it's not wrong to want those things, they're not the things that we should want more of. In fact, we're actually hardwired, our brains are hardwired to want the wrong things for happiness. So, it makes you feel a little bit better. Laurie Santos, a Yale professor of psychology, refers to this as the annoying features of the brain. And I have them here on this slide. So the first trick of our brain is that our mind's strongest intuitions are often wrong. And that's because we get the wrong information that has developed over time. And the second brain trick is that our minds don't think in absolutes, but we judge relevant to reference points, which means we compare ourselves to others all the time. And that affects our happiness, and usually affects our happiness in a negative way. So whether it's your salary, your social status, your possessions, your abilities, We compare ourselves to others all the time. However, those are perceived comparisons, and they might not actually be true, but they still do impact our well-being. Um, and our happiness. And the third thing our brain does is it makes us get used to things, which is referred to as hedonic adaptation. We mentioned that before. And it's a process that we're becoming used to positive or negative stimuli so that the emotional effects are reduced over time, and things become our new normal, and then we reset our reference point. So for example, when we get a salary raise, we'd be super happy, but after a while, the new salary becomes the new normal. We reset our reference point and we start looking for the next raise, and on and on and on. The fourth one there is impact bias, which means that we tend to overestimate the emotional impact of a life event. And when things happen to us, and particular negative things, we tend to just zoom in on that particular event and forgetting all of the other good things that are happening and that are going on. And when that happens, we also forget that we have the tools in, like, naturally our resilience to deal with those adverse events, and thus it affects our happiness negatively. So how do we achieve that better wanting so we can be happier? And it's by investing more time in these things. So using our signature strengths, the ones that we shared earlier in the section on workplace well-being, those 26, we just need to do more of what we're really naturally good at, because that is what makes us happier. We also know that having strong social connections makes us happier. So investing in relationships. If our connections are strong, we're less prone to stress, we're more likely to survive illness, and we're less vulnerable to premature death. So if that's not a selling point, I don't know what is. The third one there for better wanting is to stop mind wandering. Our minds are all over the place for almost half of the time, and that's because as soon as we're finished with a task, our default mode network in our brains gets activated, and that network can only think outside of the here and the now, and that causes our minds to wander. And there's a lot of science to this I won't go into, but mind wandering has a negative effect on happiness. A wandering mind is an unhappy mind, according to the researcher Gilbert, who looked into this a lot. The fourth one there is prioritizing time over money, which is associated with greater happiness. And the effects of having experiences, and some cost money, like a holiday, and some are free, like a walk with a friend. But if you compare it to things, our happiness is much longer lasting, and it could be months compared to hours or days. So investing in experiences is important. And then the last element of better wanting is to invest in healthy practices, which I think speak for itself. So I think we, like, all of these probably sound logical. I mean, we know this, right? So it's not something that we all do. So what can be done? How can we do this? And the first kind of strategy for that is situation support, is where you're fixing the bad environment and promote a healthy environment. So it's really like take the cereal off the kitchen counter and put a bowl of fruit there, for example. And the second one is goal setting, and really invest time to do this, and specify your goals. Visualize what you would feel like when you achieve that goal, and plan your goal, so that you can realize it in small steps. And then the third thing there is to engage in these requirement practices, like savoring, or practicing gratitude, being kind, getting enough sleep and exercise, but also things like meditation or mindfulness exercises, and developing our signature strength. So there's a lot of resources on that I'll share after the webinar, that you might want to look into if you're interested in all of this. I'll just finish up with a quick summary of some of the key takeaways from today. The first one is that we can learn and develop the skills that improve our resilience, and that will help us balance our resources and challenges better, which is good news. And the other thing is that the better we understand the science of well-being, the more we can improve our practices and our habits that will create your work-life balance or your good well-being. And that takes time and investment. Um, the third one takeaway is that well-being is a shared responsibility, and one that needs to be invested in all the time, both by individuals and organizations. And then finally, when it comes to workplace well-being, it is really important to have a holistic strategy if you want to create that culture of well-being. and also it becomes an increasingly a competitive advantage to do so. So I want to thank you very much for your attention, and without further ado, I'll encourage you all to join your networking now, and don't forget to put your findings and your comments in the chat for us later on for discussion. Thank you very much.